Okay, let's hope the sound kind of works. the I had a comment about Penrose and Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, the orchestrated um, reduction consciousness model, and in relation to the unconscious or the subconscious. Basically, Penrose he uses the term proto consciousness, which is from Bernard de Espinay. I read Bernard de Espinay's book Veiled Reality, oh, at least 20 years ago, probably more than 20 years ago, in the library, public library. It's it's a quantum physics book that basically argues for the De Broglie understanding of reality. Well, it says it's a possible explanation, but the unveiled reality means you have this what he calls proto consciousness being, and Bohm and Basil Basil J. Halley call it active information. But it's very much related to the Eastern philosophy of non-dualism, and somebody just posted a video on non-dualism. Somebody who lives pretty close nearby me, actually, Nate Higgins. He has a pretty big video channel on environmental issues. Well, like energy management. He was like a Wall Street guy who then got into energy economics, and um it's something I did my master's thesis on, this idea that the lack of understanding non-dualism in the West is the cause of the ecological crisis. And it's kind of it's a sort of a heady concept because we don't take philosophy very seriously in the West. I mean, it's sure you can get a degree in it, but then you can go work at a coffee shop or something. um, I mean, unless you go into teaching, but then it's kind of a who wants to take classes if they who wants to major in something where they're not gonna make any money off it because like, school's so expensive, and cost of living. But the when you really study non-dualism, you realize in my for after I studied it for so long, um, that it's secretly based on non-commutativity. And so what that means is that the Western science is based on commutative geometry. So Roger Penrose, he first used this idea of Platonic forms for in his his consciousness model. So Stuart Hameroff will frequently refer to, well, he won't frequently, but he'll occasionally mention Roger Penrose's idea of Platonic forms as being kind of like proto consciousness. But um, but actually, if you really study Penrose, he co-authored a paper on non-commutativity as being the foundation of the universe in cosmology, and proto-consciousness in terms of quantum physics is also the foundation of the universe. And of course, Penrose emphasizes that this foundation it's a process. It's not like a static realm, but also it what was I gonna say? It has no space. There's no spatial scale to it, which is another idea that people have a hard time even, like thinking about or approaching, because the Western philosophy and science is based on external measurements and seeing and truth. Seeing is what you can, or truth is what you can see. It's what you can replicate. Um, And non-commutativity is not replicable. So every instant is new. It's a new reality. It's not the multiverse. It's just that it's always like negentropy, negative entropy. So being alive is always fresh. It's what Yogananda called it, ever fresh, ever new. That's how he described reality of proto consciousness. So it's what in Indian philosophy it's called turiya, so it's the fourth state of being. So when you have deep dreamless sleep, that's unconscious. And then when you have your dream state, that would be like your subconscious. And then your waking state is another type of dream state in comparison to turiya. And when you have turiya, the fourth state of consciousness, you can have precognitive visions. And that's where things get really trippy. So in Tibetan yoga, they call it dream yoga, meaning that when you go beyond your subconscious of your dreams and you go into turiya, the fourth state of consciousness, you realize that being awake is also another type of dream. And a good book on this for it was called The Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot, and he was taking Bohmian philosophy and combining it with Karl Pribram, who argued that the brain is holographic, and basically combining them together, and so you get this holographic universe. But it's not a dream. It's not a virtual reality. It's just like everything's made of light. All the matter is made of photons, but the photons can then turn into physical matter through the virtual photons. Yeah, it's kind of complicated, but that's part of this like fifth dimension. So, like if you think of relativity as four-dimensional space time, the fifth dimension would be this proto consciousness that is actually time itself as active information. In normal physics, time is a parameter as a something that has to rely on matter to be observable. So you measure time as a spatial change of matter, like movement of matter. But in this model of reality, time exists on its own. And Lee Smolin argues for this model of reality, and his first quantum physics teacher was the same teacher I had, Herbert J. Bernstein, and that's actually the only physics class I've ever taken. Otherwise, I've just corresponded with Basil J. Hiley and studied on my own. Um, so yeah, I'm not a scientist. I don't do like mathematical equations. I study math. I study the concepts and the concepts of science. So I'm like a philosopher of science. But yeah, so Basil J. Haley tried to explain non-commutativity to Roger Penrose in terms of consciousness, and Roger Penrose was not really engaging with the idea. And this, I think, this upset Basil J. Haley a lot because they were colleagues for a long time. Like the twistor term in Penrose's cosmology is actually from Basil J. Haley because Basil J. Haley like, Roger Penrose asked him what would be a good term to use, and he was walking by in their, collegial office kinda setting, and Basil J. Haley said "twistor" with an O. So they go back, they were close friends, but, anyway, you know, it's like, I'm glad Roger Penrose is still doing his thing and active, and, it's very, very awesome that I think he's, like, 96 now, maybe? 95 for sure. Um, Bess J. Haley passed on in December of 2025, I think it was. No, 24. I think it was 20 January 25. So December 24, I think. Something like that. Not that long ago. Um, yeah, I mean, I could go on and on about it, but So the Platonic forms in this case don't really exist as much as they do as because Plato was actually wrong because Plato, you know, promoted commutative geometry as like symmetry, and that's the whole problem of Western science. Um, so Alon Khan gets into this, the math um, professor. They call it fundamental time, um, or primordial time, or like Penrose uses the term fundamental time, but he got that from Lee Smolin, and Alon Khan calls it primitive time. So it's time existing on its own before space time. And of course, in music, this is what how I and this is just how I learned time, through music training. And but in science, it's a big deal when you have this other time that's different than space time, and it's not the same as Newtonian absolute time because that was based on Platonic commutative geometry. So it is like an interactive time that is what Basil Haley called active information, and it's holographic. So it's a fifth dimension that you exist within as non-dualism, but it's also non-local, meaning that it's instantaneous at every point in space-time. So there's like every point in space-time has like a white hole, black hole on the quantum level that is beyond spatial shape or structure, beyond spatial scale. And then you can access this through meditation, through listening, and that's where my research gets into, is going into the music philosophy of non-commutativity and how it's based on meditation. And so there is a good book on this that gets into the Jungian archetype stuff that is by Harold Ottman-Spacher, and the physics professor in Australia that I corresponded with. His name's but Basil J. Haley has a chapter in that book, and that physics professor, is also a pianist. He's from, I can't remember his name right away, but yeah, I have the book in my room, but it's pretty good. So they have a chapter on Jungian philosophy, and then they have a chapter on Basil J. Haley on non-commutativity. So it's like pretty much the only book that really focuses on non-commutativity as the key idea of Basil J. Haley's work. And Basil J. Haley's told me in an email, he was really honored to be the focus of that, or get a chapter in that book. Dean Rickles, that's his name, the pianist, physics professor in Australia. So the connection between the dream state, of course, is like it's also related to psychedelics. So Stuart Hameroff argued that if you take psychedelics, that actually increases your frequency. And Roger Penrose's whole model is this collapse of space time based on frequency and energy, the momentum being inverse to the frequency as energy. And so the higher frequency you can achieve, the longer you can maintain this proto consciousness state, which is in sort of like in the platonic forms, but they're not, again, like I disagree with Stuart Hameroff when he uses the platonic form concept. He also used a concept of, he said it was like non-Western music. And that term he got from Anirban Bandyopadhyay, who I also corresponded with. And Bandyopadhyay was referring to Indian music tuning, but he himself was thinking of a different concept. Like he was like, it wasn't, anyway. I won't get into all that, the connection between like music and math or whatever, and physics. But but basically the Platonic form is the irrational number as a infinite process of measurement, and that then leads to the calculus, and it's all based on this idea of symmetry being like the foundation of reality. Um, and so you have science as a religion, or what David F. Noble called the religion of technology. So it's okay if you destroy life on Earth because you're achieving this Platonic realm somewhere in your mind as like a subconscious kind of. It's, in other words, I think it's like total insanity, and the reason is that Plato was relying on the wrong music theory, and I discussed this with math professor Luigi Borzacchini because he had a paper published from his research in 1999, and the paper got published in like 2007 on the secret music origin of Western science from incommensurability in mathematics, which is that fancy word and another fancy concept of just this like um, there's supposed to be a one-to-one correspondence with between geometry and algebraic number in Western science, but you have these logical paradoxes that stop that from happening, and that's what incommensurability is. And like that would be like Cantor's Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem is another example of incommensurability. And so most scientists say, well, it just means that math is incomplete. It's inherently incomplete, so it'll always be this infinite process of learning and progress. But there was another interpretation of Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem is that mathematics, Western math, is inherently inconsistent, logically inconsistent. And I think that's true if you look at quantum logic, the paradoxes of quantum logic, which is something Eddie Oceans was analyzing in terms of psychology. So he created quantum psychology, and Eddie Oceans, working at Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, then argued that non-commutativity solves the paradoxes of quantum logic and the and Western science as a whole. These problems of incommensurability that originally were brought up by Gregory Bateson in his book Mind and Nature: A Necessary Unity, and that's a book that I studied my first year of college. My music teacher gave me the book, and then I studied it along with the Tao Te Ching. Those are the 2 books he gave me after my music training, and I studied them on my own in my room in my first year of college as one of my main, learning projects, and it's a Gregory Bateson's book is a real mind twister because he never solves the problems he's trying to solve, so you're reading along and you're, like, kind of frustrated with him because he's really struggling. It's a really fascinating book, but Eddie Oceans was like, "Hey, I can solve this, using non-commutativity," and, which is really funny that I came back and discovered Eddie Oceans, like, 30 years later after going through all this other stuff. You come back to the same, it's all connected, right? So, anyway, so yeah, I think that Stuart Hameroff's and Roger Penrose's model, it works really well because they argue that basically there is like a hierarchy or hierarchy